Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Futurist Society, broadcasting from the present, but talking about the future. Today, we have Dr. Jason Kahn, who is a PhD in developmental psychology and the Chief Science Officer for Mightier, which is doing some pretty interesting and cool stuff in the intersection between mental health for children and their development, as well as video games, which is something that I particularly like. I'm a big gamer myself. So, Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Mightier and kind of what the future holds for you and the space itself?
Hi there. Absolutely. Happy to dive in. But first, just absolutely want to say thank you. Thanks. Excited to be here and excited to have the conversation today. A little bit about me and a little bit about how we got here, I think, is probably the right starting place. And I have always taken inspiration by watching kids play. It's so powerful to see how across all of child development, we can learn so much through playing and interacting with the world and really exploring and discovering. And for me, I wanted to bring that insight into the field of mental health. I grew up playing video games. I really felt like I learned a lot playing video games. And it felt to me like that was such a powerful way to learn, and that we could start making really positive impacts in kids' lives. And that's really what led to Mightier, this idea that video games can be part of the solution for, really on two levels. Like if you think of one kid and the type of challenges they're facing, we can have an absolutely profound impact on their life. And then if you think of all the kids out there, a lot of people don't know, but it is very, very hard to get access to mental health care right now. And being able to take something as both commonplace but powerful as video games and take that thing that we all sometimes think about as a societal problem and turn that into a solution for everyone and solve this access crisis that we have going on through video games. Also, just it feels really good.
I think that video games are something that it really has not been tapped into as an educational source well. People have tried to do it, but they haven't really succeeded in it. And one of the things that I like about what you guys are doing is that, I've seen a lot of your reviews and everything like that. And it seems like kids are really enjoying it. What do you feel like is different with your approach versus some of the other things? I remember when I was younger, there was this Super Nintendo game that was trying to teach. I played it for 5 minutes, so over it, But I know that the kids that you guys are tracking are spending a lot of time on these games. So what is some of the things that you've done differently compared to?
Yeah, I would say our approach boils down. I mean, there are a couple key factors of our approach, but one of the most important ones is we take kids seriously. We understand that in order for a kid to enjoy an experience, you have to treat them like a kid and you have to treat them with your full respect. And that means really living in their world, and that means letting them play, right? I remember playing a lot of games as a kid that were quote unquote educational games, but the idea that comes out there is chocolate covered broccoli, right? Hey, I'm going to teach you how to type, but really it's just the thinnest of game layers over a typing exercise, or teach you math. But they're flashcards. They're flashcards with a little game on top of it. And kids see through that so fast. Kids don't want to be doing that. We really, the way to think about what we do is something more along the lines playing with something like Lego or something like that, right? So you want to take, as a kid, you want to feel like you have a sense of creativity, a sense of agency, some real impact on your skill and some real growth, and that there is not some adult behind the screen who is really actually just trying to tell you what to do. And our approach embraces that. Our approach specifically, so we specifically teach this skill called emotional regulation, and I can talk about that in a bit, but it tells a kid that they are the one who's in charge of their emotional regulation. And there's no right way. There's no adult who can come in and be like, hey, here's the right way to do things. It's something that the kid gets to figure out all for themselves, and something that they can be expressive about and creative about.
So I wanted to just touch on emotional regulation for just a second. So it's something that we hear a lot of more about now, things like anxiety and any sort of like mental health disorder, like ADHD or any like zooming out just from emotional regulation to just mental health disorders. Number one question is, do you see that more prevalence of that today as opposed to in the past? And number two, is that a true value, or is it just more diagnosis that's happening? Is there more insight into it now?
Yeah, it's a really good topic. Like I think, and especially like when we talk about the future of mental health, I think it becomes very important. So one of the things in medicine that we've got very good at over the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years is, we've been better at recognizing diagnoses, which has been good. But one of the things to remember about mental health and brain science in general is that we're still really, really at the beginning. And so really, as more neuroscience has come to the fore, we realize that when we think about diagnoses, we're really describing a set of symptoms and a set of patterns, but like they're not always descriptive and they're not always predictable. So what happened in the past is that we would label a child with ADHD or anxiety, and then that would prescribe a certain set of interventions, some meds, some therapy, and sometimes they would work and sometimes they wouldn't. And when they work, they're really powerful, meds included. But we weren't always great at that's description, those diagnostic descriptions, they don't always work, and they still don't always work. The follow on, as we've learned more about the brain, has been to describe a little bit more about the systems of the brain and how their growth and development can impact a child's mental health. So the regulatory system, especially the emotional regulatory system, is one of those systems, right? So that you can think about that kind of in like a flight or flight reflex, right? So like, the old example of like you see a tiger and like your brain has to decide to fight or flight or freeze. And that is that's a neurological response that is adaptive and designed, right? But you take that into the modern world, there's a social impact of that. And like having a large response to some sort of social stressor where those three responses, like they might not be appropriate. So you have to regulate. And we've gotten really good at like describing what those systems look like and what those paths look like. And so emotional regulation is really this set of neurological tools that sits in everybody's brain. Everybody everybody can do emotional regulation, that it develops, right? And if it develops in one set of directions, then maybe people have really strong reactions in social situations. Like, you can think of like the star athletes of the world who are so good at this, right? Like nothing gets to them. And then you can think of other people, potentially like you or me, who like, they're forced to go into any sort of like, novel social situation, and they either freeze or they get really nervous or they act angrily, and, they look back at that situation like, why did I do that? And what we've learned is kids with ADHD, kids with anxiety, even kids with autism, like their emotional regulation systems are not necessarily as strong as other kids. And so it really becomes very beneficial to build that system up. And building interventions to target those systems has become this new way of thinking about treatment. I think like we're still at the beginning of this, but I think it will become very powerful over the next, I don't know. I mean, mental health and medicine in general can be slow, but looking forward 10, 20 years, we're going to learn a whole lot about the brain and the systems underneath it. And anyway, roundabout way of saying emotional regulation is vitally important for everyone. Everybody needs this system, and everybody's system is at a different place, and that's okay because we can all make it stronger.
But do you feel like there's more mental health issues today than there were in the past? I feel and the reason why I was asking that question is because I feel like there is, but I don't know if that's a subjective experience because there's just more awareness about it.
I think both are true. Definitely more subjective awareness about it, and we are better at diagnosing now, right? So we are more attuned to the signs and symptoms in kids, and we're better able to identify those early and put early intervention in place, which is going to lead to increasing diagnosis rates, right? So we are being better attuned means that we are going to see this more often and we're going to respond to it. I do think there are other sides of that though. Like I do think that it's not just we're better at naming now. I think that really obviously we're coming out of the pandemic, and the pandemic was so stressful for a lot of kids. We know that the impact of removing various social structures from a kid's day-to-day life, especially school, has an impact on their development, and it can lead to things like anxiety and depression. Like we've been able to see that unfold. We also just know that like various pressures of childhood now just socially look different, right? Like that's not to impose a value judgment one way or another. Like anybody like free to do that however you see. But growing up in the current academic environment has different pressures on kids. Growing up with social media, especially as a teenager, has different pressures on
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And there's good parts and bad parts, but it's just different than when
Yeah. I think that, when I look at all of this, it's tough for me to parse out the subjective data versus the objective data. And one of the things that I think is objective is that teenage suicide rates has really increased significantly. And a lot of the blame is on social media, which I think is appropriate. I think that the technology that was put out there into the world, and we didn't really know what the repercussions of that were. And so now there's a lot of awareness about it, but objectively the rates are increasing, whether the awareness is more or the diagnosis is more. We just know that this is happening more often. So I feel like it is more of an issue. And I think a lot of people's concerns is that technology is a driver for a lot of these mental health issues, which is personally something that I really like seeing people like you that are using technology for benefit for some of these societal ills. And that's why I get so hopeful about the future, is because technology is a tool, right? And it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And for whatever reason, the first iteration is always about getting the most dollars out of whatever user that you can. And then it's like, now that we have enough awareness about the negative effects of it, now there's people like yourself and regulation and different things that are happening that are kind of scaling back. But I do think that we just haven't found that happy medium of making something beneficial and for it to be something that is really good for capital. And that's something that I hope that things like video games would kind of veer more in that direction. But irrespective of that, I think that the experience of video games is really powerful. Like I can remember there's lots of video game experiences that have shaped me as a person. Like I remember beating, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and it was such a big accomplishment for me. And I felt so proud of myself, even though it was a game, right? And I want my daughter to have that. I want your kids, I don't know if those things are available. But let me get back into what Mightier is doing. So you guys have a heart rate monitor that when somebody heart rate gets too high, because they're getting into that fight or flight system, you teach them to calm themselves down, correct? But what are the tools? Is it just deep breathing, or what are the emotional regulation tools that are being taught to children through your app?
Yeah, I mean, to jump to the end, for every kid, for every person, it's what works for you is the best tool. And I think that one of the things that, the way Mightier works, you play video games, right? And you play video games with a monitor, a heart rate monitor that can see that, that emotional response in you to a video game. And what happens when that moment, what happens in that moment is the video game gets harder, right? So this is a little backwards for every adult, but let's walk through it. We can actually walk through it with a very Zelda example, because I love playing Zelda. I still play Zelda, but it would be as if you're playing Ocarina of Time, you're in the middle of a boss fight, your body is reacting to that boss fight, and your health starts to deplete because of your reaction. That would be the Mightier example of playing Zelda. And what happens is that for a kid, they all of a sudden are aware that their body is now part of the game. Their emotions are now part of the game. Rather than having that now becomes part of where they have control, right? So rather than this thing that you don't have control over, all of a sudden do have control over it, and you can cool yourself down. It's exactly what we call it inside of Mightier. You cool yourself down and you get back to this place where you are in more of an optimal space. And you then, in that experience, that happens over and over and over again, and you practice over and over and over again, cooling yourself down. You see it on the screen, you see the impact, and you get a reward for cooling yourself down. So that set of practice, that moment of practice that happens hundreds, if not thousands of times in Mightier, what happens is for kids, it becomes automatic, because remember, we talked emotional regulation is neural circuitry. You practice neural circuitry, it becomes more automatic over time. That's kind of nice. The brain kind of works like muscles in that way. And we've seen through scientific trials, we've seen through qualitative evidence, we've seen through anecdotes with our families, like that kids take this skill that they learn inside of Mighty Earth, it becomes part of who they are, and they take it outside, they take it to their school, they take it to their families, they take it to the soccer field, wherever the kids are. And like, that's the heart, like that's really the heart of learning inside of Mighty Earth. For kids who need extra support, like we don't tell kids how to regulate. There's no one right way, like, right? That's part of just expecting kids and treating kids as if they do have agency and they are smart and they can figure things out. But we do give them some support. So we give them skills like deep breathing. We give them skills like progressive muscle relaxation. There are a couple others inside of Mighty Earth, so they can get started. Actually, this is very cool. We're in the process of preparing a paper. It hasn't gone through peer review yet, but it looks like we have some data that really suggests that implicit learning, that part where you're figuring it out by yourself, is really where the magic is happening, which is cool. Like, I mean, that's what we expect out of kids. That's what we've seen over and over again in some of both the classical and modern, like, developmental science literature.
I think it's also real world, like, too, right? I mean, if I'm in a surgery and I'm pissed off about something, like, that is going to make my outcomes less effective than if I was totally calm. And if I have the ability to emotionally regulate, that's something that I think that would lead to better outcomes. They just actually, my sister, who's also a physician, sent me an article that recently came out that surgeons have worse outcomes on their birthdays. Like, if you're thinking about other things, if like you're trying to rush, then your outcomes are worse. And so I think that there's a lot of real world outcomes that would benefit from kind of like what you're trying to teach kids through implicit learning. But also I think that's like the goal of therapy, right? Like, just when I'm talking with a therapist, they're questioning my own perspective so that I come to that conclusion by myself. And it's not quite the same, but I feel like it's similar enough that, those breakthroughs that I've had in therapy, I could see that happening with kids as well. What is the data showing in regards to the effectiveness of something like you versus, cognitive behavioral therapy or medications or some of these other tried and true methods for mental health issues that we've seen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say, like, and I mean, again, like I started my career in academic medicine in a department of psychiatry. The effect sizes for medications, when we get the diagnosis right, are very large. Effect size is basically how much of an impact, like, think about it as practical impact, right? And so I think that something like, I mean, again, like, one of the challenges with the diagnostic model as it exists today is that sometimes, and parents, actually, I've personally gone through this, with our child, like the process of finding that right medication can be very difficult. And we, get diagnoses wrong because, again, mental health is in its infancy. But, when a med works, it really can work for a family. The impact of Mighty Earth is actually on par with medications when we start looking at effect sizes. It is, maybe slightly less, but it is in the same neighborhood. And I think, again, CBT is one of those things where, for the right kid at the right time, when it works, it really works, and the effect size can be quite large. The biggest challenge we have with CBT in the community is that it's just really hard. So there are a couple things. So first of all, you need experts. You need experts to deliver CBT. There are not enough experts. The wait lists at academic hospitals are in the hundreds, if not thousands, these days. It's a long, long time to get in to see an expert. And then what happens, unfortunately, is that we often lose kids really quickly, right? Because unfortunately, it's a burden. Telehealth makes this a little better, but you have to come in, the kid has to like their therapist, like, building that relationship is really important. It's really hard for someone. I mean, unfortunately, like, these are people who look like you and me. It's really hard for us to relate to 10-year-olds. Kids get bored, and then the parent has to weigh, is it worth the fight to drive my kid in? Tea, for our subway here in Boston that sometimes works.
Yeah, burnout is real, especially with kids.
It's just hard. It's hard to get kids into therapy, and it's hard to keep kids into therapy. And so, like, really, like, yes, it's phenomenally impactful. Like, the therapists are amazing at their jobs. It's just their jobs are really hard, and it's reflected in the numbers. We're actually losing therapists faster than we're bringing them into the workforce. So, I mean, honestly, like, within the context, especially within the conversations like that you're inspiring us to have, like, our future is digital tools augmenting therapy, like that is our future. Like we're not going to be able to deliver therapy at the scale it's needed in a one-to-one context. And
Yeah.
we've got to figure that out.
I mean, I hope so. I hope that, we can improve access to care at a quality that is consistent with the actual human therapist. And I honestly, after everything that I've experienced with ChatGPT, I feel like we're not far away from that. I just don't know how effective that's going to be in comparison to a human therapist. But I want to just switch gears here for a second, specifically with video games and education. How do you feel about, all of the new augmented reality and virtual reality coming down the pipeline? Or do you feel like that's going to be a benefit for this kind of space? Or, like what gets you most excited about some of the technological breakthroughs that are happening right
I do. I like the idea I like the augmented and virtual reality pieces. And even the generative AI piece, I'm pretty excited by. I think that, so I actually it's interesting. I don't actually think of the specifics of the tool so much as I think about how we're learning about the brain. And so the way I think about it is that we got, both on the pharma side and the therapy side, we've gotten very good at using the tools we've got. As we learn more about how the brain works, we're going to open up new mechanisms of intervention, like interventions that have not been thought of yet. My dear is an example of this, but hopefully there are hundreds, thousands more of these things. I think that the rapid pace that we're learning about how the brain works, combined with these new technologies coming to market, things like generative AI, things like VR, things like AR, it's just going to let us be creative about approaching how the brain works and how we think about interventions. So we don't necessarily the ideas that come through in something like talk therapy or CBT are very powerful, but it's just one modality. Just like pharma is a modality, and Mightier is kind of biofeedback, it's another modality, right? And we need more modalities. We need ways that can be delivered digitally, and we need to get better. We're going to get better at describing the specific challenges that are unique to an individual. So we're going to get better at making mental health more personalized, building the specific strengths that a person needs, and then choosing the right modality for them, right? So maybe it's talk therapy, maybe it's some experience in VR that we can't think of right now, maybe it's something in AR, right? Maybe that can help you through some social situation. Maybe it's these sort of targeted neuro rehab-ish things that happen with Mightier. We don't know. And we're so I cannot emphasize how much of a pioneer we are, how much pioneers we are right now there, and even people who live in the space like me, how little we know.
Are there any, just touching on that for just a second, are there any specific breakthroughs that the layperson might not know when you're talking about how the brain works that really excite you? For example, when I look at, how my kid is developing right now, I look at it as this is a plant that I'm adding a little bit of water to, I'm adding a little bit of sunlight to. And I think the fertilizer that we have of technology is going through rapid amounts of change. My child will have access to ways to improve their brain, their mental health I didn't know about. She's going to have video games that are able to help with her mental health, but she might have augmented reality that could, help her with not only her emotional regulation, but just maybe her concentration, or, maybe her grit, all of these different aspects of our brain and personality that we might not know how to work yet or how to augment yet, but that we might know in the next 10 years, and also have a modality to help affect change in that. But regardless, that's just all my speculation. You're in the field. Is there anything that we know about how the brain works now that's coming down the pipeline that you're really excited about?
So there are a couple spaces where, again, emphasizing, even though I do spend my time here, you're in academics too, right? You end up with a very detailed sliver of knowledge, and it's hard, sometimes it's hard to break out. But for me personally, I take academically, I take a lot of inspiration from how much we're learning about how the brain is connected and how the various systems of the brain work together. And that specifically comes out in our our work on emotional regulation. And that becomes a direct outcome because we've been able to learn that, the part of the brain that is responsible for the generation of emotions is connected to the part of the brain, which is a different part of the brain, which is responsible for the regulation. And that part of regulation is something practicing, you can expose kids to that and strengthen that connection over time. And that is, that type of neuroscience continues to be built. And so that's specifically working at connectivity of the brain. That work is continuing and developing faster than anyone can possibly keep up with. And it is amazing how much we're learning about how humans and how brains work right now. There is another piece that makes me excited that is a little less well known, but there's this mathematical representation of learning called dynamic systems theory. And it really describes how people become sort of, and it's macro and it's esoteric, but I'm super glad we got here because I don't usually get to talk about it.
Yeah, I would love to.
My extreme nerdiness.
No, I love deep dives into this stuff. That's great.
This idea that you end up in this place where your brain becomes stable and comfortable in certain patterns. And the way this gets described in sort of a lay space is let's say you have a salt shaker and you put in the same place every day, every single time. You move it, where's the first place you're going to look? It's the old place. Even if you're the one who moved it, right? You're still going to look at the old place. Your brain just becomes really these patterns become stable. And it turns out you can describe behavior in the same way. And when you start doing that, you start ending up with these ideas of how, if we think about this as a system, how can we approach that stability that has been generated? And how can we intervene in ways where maybe disrupting that stability will be beneficial? Something like regulation, where we have a maladaptive or response is getting really angry or yelling or throwing or hitting, something like mightier is a response. How do you build a new stability? How do you build something that is more adaptive and feels we're really reducing a brain to a system and a kid to a system, but the system is happier, the system is more stable when it takes a more regulated approach. And how can we encourage that? You can play forward in ways I don't really understand and don't have answers to, right? But we can think about other disorders or diagnoses as stability too, right? It has somehow become brains have somehow become stable in an anxious or depressed state. Are there other ways to think about what are interventions that might put the brain in a different way of being stable? There are things that I think about. There are things that I also don't want to pretend I have anything resembling the answers for. Well,
I think that is a really cool topic that I just want to dive into for just a second, because when I think of, just the salt shaker analogy, kids are more plastic in their ability to change their behavior. Is that correct?
Yes.
If we intervene earlier, hopefully the thought is that they'll, gain skills that are more adaptive and they're able to kind of outgrow their anxiety or outgrow their ADHD or something like that. Is there any evidence of that? Is there just my feeling, or is there objective evidence that says if we intervene earlier, then those interventions are much more effective than when a person's older?
Well, there's absolutely there's mountains of objective evidence that early intervention makes a massive difference across any number of neurodevelopmental disorders. So autism has been studied hugely, right? And so we know the earlier we intervene in autism, we can have better outcomes for that kid later in life. And we've reacted to as a society, we've reacted to that. We put in screening in place. We've been able to catch it earlier. And I think, we're doing a lot of good. Even things more on the educational side. So you think about something like dyslexia. So we've done a massive amount of work to understand a lot of the neurological underpinnings of something like dyslexia. And because of that, we have there's actually the education world is actually doing this massive fundamental shift in how they approach reading education. Is a direct response to our neurological understanding of how the brain works. And
what is this shift like? Can you explain that to me?
Oh, so we actually, again, it's a little adjacent to my field, but basically it's it's a Tufts person, it's Marion Wolf, but like she did this a massive, like how the brain organizes, like dyslexia there's challenges in how the brain organizes sounds and visual input and puts it together into language. And continuing on this massive oversimplification, like we know in that case that like direct phonics instruction early leads to better reading outcomes really for all kids. And so there's been a push in education, again, like not my direct field, but like there's been a push in reading education to really change that approach. And like, I don't know, that's all spilled out into the news at this point. Like now there's all these pop sci and even mainstream media articles on how we're approaching education, especially education of reading. But I don't know, it's actually like a really nice example of how just massively evolving understanding of how the brain works is leading to hopefully better outcomes for everyone, kids with dyslexia, but across the board.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I have hope that with examples that you have talked about, that we really should be shifting our focus to developmental psychology, because if we can intervene early, then those outcomes are going to be better. And I think that that's just the case across the board with medicine, period. Like for the 20th century, we were very focused on what I call sick care, which is end of the road interventions to like, this person already has diabetes and like we just need to make it better. But now I feel like in the 21st century, there's a lot more focus on preventing these things before they even happen. And that I feel like is kind of spilled out into like the public consciousness, and people like me who are not in your field look at these things and say like, we really need to intervene early. So I hope that that trend continues, but I think it will. And I think that technology will be just like a huge tool that we use to give people the kind of help that they need at an earlier space. And hopefully that will lead to more well-balanced society. But I wanted just to kind of talk about just the way that we emotionally regulate for just a few minutes, because I feel like that's something that, is of particular importance to me, because I have a kid who's almost 2 years old now. So like, when are you intervening in children, trying to get them to the point where they are able to emotionally regulate themselves? Like your app, what is the age group for that? Is that something that you're intervening like when they're just able to talk and have a conversation? Like when should I as a parent be focusing on their emotional well-being?
Yeah, so our app works really for kids. I would say we work for 6 to 14, and and hitting kids obviously as early as possible is really important. Unsurprising, there's a deep dive here for, practical parenting advice. There's more to the story. I think that, well, kids build regulation really from birth. So you see this idea of co-regulation starting with, when you're born, you rely on your external environment completely to help you with regulation. So you're crying, you usually responds to a need, you're hungry, you're tired. And really that is like the idea of co-regulation, is that you are depending on the external world to regulate for you, with you. And kids develop regulation as they go. So like there is a critical period around 2 as like the prefrontal cortex, like you start to see myelination through there. So basically means that more of the brain is available to the kid. But like, so you start to see more independence in the regulatory skill through then, and then developing, and then you reach, you don't really see that system or pathway and it's like full capacity until till the end of adolescence, which for boys is like 24. It's pretty late. It's not what we think of as like the 18-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And I think that like throughout that entire period, like we are, the capacity for change is enormous. How we approach change looks different throughout that entire period, but our capacity for change is enormous. And even after, like even once we hit adulthood, our brains are never fixed in place, right? Our brains are constantly changing and adapting. And so you can continue to see change. It's, our tools look different. And that's where more of the cognitive tools start to take hold. So things like CBT become really powerful.
I know you're a dad yourself, and we talked a little bit about that before the podcast started. What are some interventions that you're doing to make sure that your kids are really well developed and really achieving their best potential?
Yeah, that's a great question. what we do, we're a strong believer in balance and everything, right? So our kids, maybe starting with the things that parents get most nervous about, our kids get screen time, our kids get videos, play plenty of video games, they get to watch TV. And we've tried to put structures in place around them where they can even self-manage, right? So it's like some sense of like there are lots of choices available to you. What is the thing that is going to make you happy in this moment? Is it going to be the screen? Is it going to be playing with toys? Is it going to be going outside? We do encourage an awful lot of outside time with our kids. Our kids are personally for our kids, they've taken to sports, both of them have, and so have really encouraged that. And multiple sports. For especially for our oldest, soccer has really become like his primary thing, but encouraging like really anything that he can find and enjoy. Obviously, academics, reading, other kids find a lot of value in music. Like we tried to make, again, making the introduction available and making music a choice, even if it's, for them, it's not their specific thing. I think that for all of these things, there's a physician at Boston Children's Hospital who talks about like a screen time diet and like just being intentional with everything. And it's been something that we've really tried to embrace.
Is screen time really that bad? Like, is it objectively bad? Like, and because I feel like if everybody's doing it, right? And I know from my cohort of parents that, that I hang out with, like that it's just the necessary evil in their lives. I don't even consider it to be evil, to
Yeah,
be
I
quite
don't think
honest with
it's
you.
evil. I
Yeah.
actually, I worry the most about when kids get no screen time. I truly,
Hmm.
because what's going to happen at some point is these kids are going to we live in a world where screens are a reality.
Yeah.
At some point, these like every single child is going to have to interact with screens. And
Hmm.
I think that, to be honest, like I worry about my own kids being exposed to social media with absolutely no preparation whatsoever for, the good and the bad, right? Like, it's easy to go into the bad, but like, if we don't engage with the ideas of online bullying early, then if the first time that happens is like when they're off at college, like they have no tools, they have no capacity for like taking that on.
Hmm.
And I think that not that I would ever subscribe to the idea that screen time is ills or vice or anything like that, but even if we like look at that view, like it is so ubiquitous that kids need, like, the earlier we can involve them in some of the dark pieces, then like the quicker, like, again, like we can be more controlled, we can figure out pathways to resilience. Now, that is like a very negative take on screen time that I don't actually personally subscribe to. Like there are so many, like our capacity for learning, our capacity for connection, like it is enormous. And there is objective evidence all across the board of where kids are benefiting from really very traditional views of like very traditional uses of screen time, not even like the more novel things like My Dear, but being able to play video games with a set of friends, being able to communicate with a set of friends, being able to be creative and expressive in something like Minecraft, building like social and team objectives in a multiplayer video game, connecting with identity groups that might be marginalized in social media. Like these things happen and they're all like, they're very good. Like they're really important. And so
Hmm.
like we can't just, if we are in a conversation where like we're like, look, screens are the problem, then I'm not sure the premise is all there.
I've done enough research to be semi-knowledgeable in this. I kind of wanted to speak with you about it because I personally have exposed my kid to the screen time when I just need her to be distracted. And I feel like that's something that every parent does at some point in their life, because there's times like if you're on an airplane or if you're at the dentist office and your kid comes to, wait, you can't have them just like rummaging around and getting into things, right? It's just something that is a tool for me to occupy their concentration. And when I'm doing that, there are definitely sources of media that I've given her that I know are beneficial for her, like that have increased her word capacity, that have, given her like the ability to identify things. She like pointed at something the other day and she was like octopus. And I was like, how do you know what an octopus is? Like, that's crazy. And I feel like there's a lot of benefit to it. And more importantly, is that like all of these other kids are doing it, right? So she's interacting with all these other kids that are exposed to screen time. So if she's not doing it on some level, that's going to be difficult for her socially, and limit her social engagement with other kids. But from what I've read, the negative aspect of it is that it's not dynamic learning, right? It's just like passive learning. It's like really processed food. And that information is just being fed to her in such a way that, it opens up pathways in her brain that should not be opened up at that level. I don't know. Explain to me the science behind the negative aspects of screen time.
I mean, that's actually a hard one for me to do because
Yeah.
I honestly I'm not sure that I don't want, I want to be careful, right? But this is where the idea of balance comes in, right? So if you're only learning is through screens, then yes, we can talk to you we can talk to it, we can put it in the same terms of only doing one thing over and over and over and over and over again. And we can talk about how maybe there would be a detrimental effect on learning and detrimental effect on creativity. We can engage in that hypothetical. I think this is where, as a parent, intentionality just becomes so important, right? So the things you talked about. So first of all, entertainment is a value. A kid finding a few minutes to be entertained and understand and live in another world, has absolute value. A parent having a moment of peace is of value. Because your well-being has a outsized impact on your kids' well-being. And so if you need to cook dinner or get through a plane ride or have clean teeth, all of these directly impact your kids' health. The social connection, the ability to talk to kids at school and have moments of interaction with kids at school are a value. And so all of these things are great. I think it's all about making choices and being intentional, right? So it's in addition to the moment of screen time or the moment of entertainment, maybe there's an opportunity to play with, a Lego or some more open-ended toy. Maybe there's a moment to go outside and kick a ball or go on a walk, or there's value to being bored. There absolutely is value to being bored and explore and live in your thoughts. And yes, a screen is always a choice, and that has to be made in terms of just like playing with Legos is a choice, just like being on a walk is a choice, just like being bored, maybe not a choice if you're from the kid perspective, but could be a choice from the parent perspective. And I think that I don't know, I would encourage parents to understand that screens can be the right choice. They can be providing a learning environment that would not be available without a screen. They could be providing that moment of entertainment. They could, I don't know. They can be providing that moment of experience and empathy as you immerse yourself in a story. They can be providing that social connection. I remember once, I wish I could remember the quote, but I even dug up some thing, as we were when we were teaching the world how to read, people became horrified. Everyone was all of a sudden going to be get in books. It's no, it's okay. There are yes, the world changes and the way we entertain ourselves changes. We can't get overly caught up on a value. We just have to understand that a healthy kid has lots of experiences, and screens are going to be part of that. It's just, there's no way around it. Screens are going to be part of one of that set. That's what growing up right now means.
Is there any negative associations with concentration because of the amount of media that's available to kids these days? For example, the paradox of choices, right? I can go on Netflix and I can just scroll forever because there's just so much that's available to me. And then there's so much available to children too, right? They can go on YouTube and there's literally millions of videos that are available to them. Is there any negative associations with that?
I think negative is a strong word. There absolutely is. The ability for kids, how kids maintain and switch attention is probably changing, and there's probably objective evidence at that point, sifting through peer-reviewed literature. It's hard. What becomes hard is the positive negative value judgment, right? So for the world as it for the world as it exists for us as adults, being able to sustain attention as we know it and being able to attend to a bunch of different things usually is not a good thing. It's hard to say like it's hard to say how the world changes and how kids change their world as they grow and adapt, right? Like kids are just going to build a different world. And so, I mean, we're deep into philosophy, right? Like at this point, like kids' pattern of attention is changing. We know that. Like, sure.
Is it changing as in they have less attention than previous generations?
Well, but they're also faster at shifting attention, which could be like, I mean, could be construed as a good thing.
Is that's objectively measured? Because like I see my younger family members and they can spend hours in a video game, and I could also spend hours in a video game, but their ability to just do that is more than I was able to do when I was younger.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I'd have to pull up papers, but like I do think like I mean I've definitely been like, I mean, there's been things coming through. Like, I mean, how kids attend, what kids attend to, the speed at which they switch, the speed at which they'll spend on any one stimulus. Like, I do think that we've seen some amount of change in that. That definitely leads to value judgments from adults. Like, again, and this is like a population level piece, right? Like, this isn't like any one kid. Like, we can watch, you know, I mean, there are going to be, and like anyone who finds something that they're truly immersed in can spend a lot of time in that space. I think the part that gets hard for me is the question of like, where is the line on I don't like as an adult coming in and saying this is good or bad. I guess like I struggle with something like ADHD, where it is very prominently impacting the kids functioning in school like that. Like, sure, like I'm more than willing to come in and say like, hey, look, like we should intervene, we should build a plan for this kid. I think that like that piece of like, okay, like kids' patterns of attention are changing, like sure, and the world is changing and lots of things are changing, and
that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah, it's just change. Gotcha. Right. Yeah. Okay, I get that. One specific trait that has been shown to be a predictor of future success is self-control, like the old marshmallow experiment, where you put a kid on a chair and you put marshmallows in front of them and you tell them to wait, and how long they can wait was consistent with achievement later in life. Is there any technology or intervention that you know that can increase that?
So actually, specifically, like that's where we hypothesize Mightier is like a massive help, right? Because that is a regulatory pathway. Like ability to delay gratification is something that is, yes, we know is very important, right? We know that kids who can delay gratification, who can exhibit that top-down control, have a meaningful, like they do have better success markers later. It's actually across the board. Social relationships, like people have looked at like marriage outcomes, like wealth, like various achievements, like health, even like, I mean, it is impressive how important that pathway can be. And so things like Mightier are improving regulation capacity, which is good. And then, you know, I think that like, I mean, again, like that's from a parent perspective, like, you know, that Mightier is an intervention. So if your kid needs help, like you can turn to an intervention, but being proactive, like, again, it just comes back to like the wealth of experiences that kids have, like, you know, being able to experience many different, like, just a lot of age appropriate play, like starts to introduce this idea of waiting and delaying gratification. And like, there's not, Mightier as an intervention can be helpful, but like as a like sort of like, you know, you talk about preventative, like play. It's
that's cool. Well, listen, like we're getting to the end of our time, and with all my guests, I asked them a few questions that I really want to know, but maybe the conversation didn't go there, or maybe we were thinking about them in the conversation, but I didn't want to ask while we were talking. So the first one that I asked almost all my guests is, you know, for me, a lot of what motivates me about building the future is science fiction. I look at, you know, the utopian views of how we're going to be living in the future, like Star Trek, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I hope that we can get to that place. Or when it comes to robots, I think of Isaac Asimov and, you know, all the amazing benefits that those robots have for society. What drives you in building the future? What are some sources of inspiration for you?
Yeah, I mean, we've hinted at them a little bit. My own two kids are huge sources of inspiration, like watching them play and grow and trying to figure out how to take the things that like I see making them successful and, you know, use the technology that we have or could have to like even amplify that even further. It's a huge part of how I keep going. I think about how much all sorts of play meant to me as a kid. Lego was a big one for me, but also video games. and how I can use those tools and like both the happiness that they brought me, but also like the learning and like make them part of like how we support kids as they grow up. Like that's really where I get my inspiration from.
Cool. One of the things that we did not talk about, which I feel like I wanted to, but it would be like a huge sidetrack, is the idea of our children having a really great relationship with something that's not human, right? Like, for example, my daughter might have as a best friend a robot in the future, something that's artificial that has a personality that's just built for her. Do you look forward to that? Is that something that you feel like would be a benefit for society, or how do you feel about that? Because it's something that's just recently coming into the consumer space. You have robots like Moxie, which is like a little robot that kind of teaches you things and has a little bit of a personality. How do you feel about that as a developmental psychologist?
The long answer, well, the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is we're very social creatures. I think there is a very like real benefit. I think, I think we're wired as a group to like just take value out of like our group and like the sort of like unpredictable and like nature of just like being in that peer group. And I don't know. I mean, I think that I am excited and I'm eager to see how it all plays out. And like I think that one of the things that is very true about the world is we're about to learn how much like how this all plays out. And I do think that there are, I think our ideas are gonna change fast. And I don't know. Like, I mean, I think about it a lot, and I like for all the thinking I do, I don't actually feel like I have like I don't feel like I've strongly been like, yes, I'm really excited by this, or I'm really worried about this.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm hopefully optimistic about it. I think that any sort of social interaction, whether it's with a human or a dog or a cat, is benefit for that person. And I'm sure that you've seen like these little seals that they give older individuals in Japan that have added a lot of benefit to their life. And I think that that's something that I see in the robot space that I'm really excited about. I hope that my kid is an early adopter in that, because I think any sort of social benefit leads to more quality of life, in my opinion. But the last thing that I wanted to ask you, where do you specifically the therapy space and the mental health space being in 10 years with the advent of all this new technology? Like, what do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, we touched upon this a little bit, I think, but I think we're going to see a whole lot more reliance on digital tools. We have to, like, we're already past the breaking point of what humans can provide. And so we have to learn how to, like, the next set of changes are going to be what sort of tools can live, sort of in parallel to human therapy. So just like something that you get before you see a therapist, or something that you get as an alternative to a therapist, or something like along those lines. So that's the parallel direction. And then the augmentative direction is, how as a therapist can you take the type of things that you would do with technology and use them to just expand your reach. Telehealth is like sort of only like the very tip of the iceberg on this front, like, right? So like now you can see people over the world or the state, or however but we're going to see a whole lot more of that, because therapists are going to be asked to see more people, and they're going to be naturally, like, they're going to be looking for tools that can help them do that. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to keep up. And I think that where we are now, we as you pointed out at the beginning, like the prevalence is not getting smaller. I think that this just where the world is right now, we are pushing more and more need for mental health interventions. Like you pointed to the teenage suicide rates as like is a very obvious example of that. And so we need to figure out how to do better. And I think we will. I think we're going to get there very quickly.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's going to be something like going to the gym. Like, everybody knows they need to do it. It just becomes part of their daily habit. And just like you have exercise for the body, you're going to have therapy for the mind, and it'll just be kind of ingrained in society. Well, thanks so much, Jason. It was really nice speaking with you, and to all of our listeners, it was nice having you. We'll see you guys in the future. Have a good one, everybody.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.